1. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, by birth, belonged to the patricians whom we may consider as corresponding to the Epaphroditos. Among his ancestors is enumerated Rufinus, who became consul, but is less noted for attaining this honor than for the infamy which befell him. He was detected in possessing above 10 pounds weight of silver plate, which amount the law did not permit, and he was ejected from the Senate. His immediate descendants continued in a mean condition, and Sola himself was brought up with no great paternal property. When he was a young man, he lived in lodgings for which he paid some moderate sum, which he was afterwards reproached with when he was prospering beyond his deserts, as some thought. It was after the Libyan expedition, when he was assuming airs of importance and a haughty tone, that a man of high rank and character said to him, "How can you be an honest man, who are now so rich, and yet your father left you nothing?" For though the Romans no longer remained true to their former integrity and purity of morals, but had declined from the old standard, and let in luxury and expense among them, they still considered it equally a matter of reproach for a man to have wasted the property that he once had, and not to remain as poor as his ancestors. Subsequently, when Sulla was in the possession of power and was putting many to death, a man of the class of libertini, who was suspected of concealing a prescribed person, and for this offense was going to be thrown down the Tarpeian rock, reproached Sulla with the fact that they had lived together for some time in one house, that he had paid 2,000 sestertii for his lodgings, which were in the upper part of the house, and Sulla 3,000 for the lower rooms, and consequently that between their fortunes there was only the difference of 1,000 sestertii, which is equivalent to 250 Attic drachmae. This is what is recorded of Sulla's early condition. 2. As for his person, we may judge of it by his statues, except his eyes and complexion. His eyes were an uncommonly pure and piercing blue, which the color of his face rendered still more terrific, being spotted with rough red blotches, interspersed with the white, from which circumstance, it is said, he got his name Sola, which had reference to his complexion. And one of the Athenian satirists in derision made the following verse in allusion to it: "Sola is a mulberry besprinkled with meal." It is not out of place to avail ourselves of such traits of a man who is said to have had so strong a natural love of buffoonery, that when he was still young and of no repute, he spent his time and indulged himself among mimi and jesters. And when he was at the head of the state, he daily got together from the Scena and the theatre the lewdest persons, with whom he would drink and enter into a contest of coarse witticisms, in which he had no regard to his age, and besides degrading the dignity of his office, he neglected many matters that required attention. It was not Sulla's habit, when he was at table, to trouble himself about anything serious, but though he was energetic and rather morose at other times, he underwent a complete change as soon as he went into company and was seated at an entertainment, for he was then exceedingly complacent, and singers of mimi and dancers, and easy of access and affable. This habit of relaxation seems to have produced in him the vice of being exceedingly addicted to women, and that passion for enjoyment which stuck to him to his old age. In his youth, he was for a long time attached to one Metrobius, an actor. The following incident also happened to him. He formed an attachment to a woman named Nicopolis, who was of mean condition but rich, and from long familiarity and the favor which he found on account of his youth, he came to be considered as a lover, and when the woman died, she left him her heir. He also succeeded to the inheritance of his stepmother, who loved him as her own son, and in this way he acquired a moderate fortune. 3. On being appointed quaestor to Marius in his first consulship, he sailed with him to Libya to prosecute the war against Jugurtha. In this campaign, he showed himself a man of merit, and by availing himself of a favorable opportunity, he made a friend of Bacchus, king of the Numidians. Some ambassadors of Bacchus, who had escaped from Numidian robbers, were hospitably received by Sulla, and sent back with presents and a safe conduct. Now Bacchus happened for some time to have disliked his son-in-law Jugurtha, whom he was also afraid of. And as Jugurtha had been defeated by the Romans and had fled to Bacchus, he formed a design to make him his prisoner and deliver him to his enemies. But as he wished Sulla to be the agent rather than himself, he invited Sulla to come and see him. Sulla communicated the message to Marius, and taking a few soldiers with him, ventured on the hazardous enterprise of putting himself in the hands of a barbarian who never kept his faith, even with his friends, and this for the purpose of having another man betrayed to him. Bacchus, having got both of them in his power, was under the necessity of being treacherous to one of them, and after great fluctuations in his resolution, he finally carried into effect his original perfidious design, and surrendered Jugurtha to Sulla. Marius enjoyed the triumph for the capture of Jugurtha, but the honor of the success was given to Sulla through dislike of Marius, which caused Marius some uneasiness, for Sulla was naturally of an arrogant disposition, and as this was the first occasion on which he had been raised from a mean condition and obscurity to be of some note among his fellow citizens, and had tasted the sweets of distinction, he carried his pride so far as to have a seal ring cut, on which the occurrence was represented, and he wore it constantly. The subject represented was Bacchus surrendering, and Sulla receiving the surrender of Jugurtha. 4. Though Marius was annoyed at this, yet as he still thought Sulla beneath his jealousy, he employed him in his campaigns, in his second consulship in the capacity of legate, and in his third consulship as tribune. And by his instrumentality, Marius effected many important objects. In his capacity of legate, Sulla took Copilius, king of the Tectosages, and when he was a tribune, he persuaded the powerful and populous nation of the Marsi to become friends and allies to Rome. But now perceiving that Marius was jealous of him and was no longer willing to give him the opportunity of distinguishing himself, but opposed his further rise, Sulla attached himself to Catulus, the colleague of Marius, who was an honest man, but inactive as a soldier. Sulla, being entrusted by Catulus with all matters of the greatest moment, thus attained both influence and reputation. In his military operations he reduced a large part of the Alpine barbarians, and on one occasion, when there was a scarcity of provisions in the camp, he undertook to supply the want, which he did so effectually, that the soldiers of Catulus had not only abundance for themselves, but were enabled to relieve the army of Marius. This, as Sulla himself says, greatly annoyed Marius. Now this enmity, so slight and childish in its foundation and origin, was continued through civil war and the inveterate animosity of faction, till it resulted in the establishment of a tyranny and the complete overthrow of the constitution, which shows that Euripides was a wise man and well acquainted with the diseases incident to states, when he warned against ambition as the most dangerous and the worst of demons to those who are governed by her. 5. Sulla now thought that his military reputation entitled him to aspire to a political career, and accordingly, as soon as the campaign was ended, he began to seek the favor of the people, and became a candidate for the praetorship. But he was disappointed in his expectations. He attributed his failure to the populace, for he says that they knew he was a friend of Bacchus, and if he filled the office of aedile before that of praetor, they expected to have brilliant hunting exhibitions and fights of Libyan wild beasts, and that therefore they elected others to the praetorship, with the view of forcing him to serve as aedile. But that Sulla does not state the real cause of his failure appears evident from what followed. In the next year he obtained the praetorship, having gained the votes of the people, partly by solicitation and partly by bribery. It was an allusion to this, and during his praetorship, when he was threatening Caesar to use his own authority against him, that Caesar replied with a laugh, "You are right in considering your authority as your own, for you bought it." After the expiration of his praetorship, he was sent to Cappadocia for the purpose, as it was given out, of restoring Ariobarzanes to his power, but in reality to check Mithridates, who was very active, and was acquiring new territory and dominion as extensive as what he already had. Sulla took with him no large force of his own, but meeting with zealous cooperation on the part of the allies, he slaughtered a great number of the Cappadocians, and on another occasion, a still greater number of Armenians, who had come to the relief of the Cappadocians, drove out Gordius and declared Ariobarzanes king. While he was staying near the Euphrates, the Parthian general Orobazes, a commander of King Arsaces, had an interview with him, which was the first occasion on which the two nations met. And this also may be considered as one of the very fortunate events in Sulla's successful career, that he was the first Roman to whom the Parthians addressed themselves in their request for an alliance and friendship with Rome. Sulla is said to have had 3 chairs placed, one for Ariobarzanes, another for Arobazes, and a third for himself, on which he took his seat between the two, while the business was transacted. The king of the Parthians is said to have put Arobazes to death for submitting to this indignity. As to Sulla, some commended him for his haughty treatment of the barbarians, while others blamed him for his arrogance and ill-timed pride. It is said there was a man among the attendants of Arobazes, a Chaldean, who examined the countenance of Sulla and observed the movements of his mind and body, not as an idle spectator, but studying his character according to the principles of his art. And he declared that of necessity that man must become the first of men, and he wondered that he could endure not to be the first already. On his return to Rome, Censorinus instituted proceedings against Sulla on the charge of having received large sums of money, contrary to express law, from a king who was a friend and ally of the Romans, Censorinus did not bring the matter to a trial, but gave up the prosecution. 6. His quarrel with Marius was kindled anew by fresh matter supplied by the ostentation of King Bacchus, who, with the view of flattering the Roman people and pleasing Sulla, dedicated in the Capitol some figures bearing trophies, and by the side of them placed a gilded figure of Jugurtha, being surrendered by himself to Sulla. Marius was highly incensed and attempted to take the figures down, while others were ready to support Sulla, and the city was all but in a flame through the two factions when the social war, which had long smoldered, burst forth in a blaze upon Rome and stopped the civil discord. In this most serious war, which was attended with many variations of fortune and brought on the Romans the greatest misery and the most formidable dangers, Marius, by his inability to accomplish anything of importance, showed that military excellence requires bodily vigor and strength. But Sulla, by his great exploits, obtained among his own citizens the reputation of a great commander, among his friends the reputation of the very greatest, and among his enemies, too, the reputation of the most fortunate of generals. Sulla did not behave like Timotheus, the son of Conon, whose success was attributed by his enemies to fortune, and they had paintings made in which he was represented asleep, while fortune was throwing a net over the cities, all which he took in a very boorish way, and got into a passion with his enemies, as if they were thus attempting to deprive him of the honor due to his exploits. And on one occasion, returning from a successful expedition, he said to the people, "Well, fortune has had no share in this campaign, at least, Athenians." Now, as the story goes, fortune showed her spite to Timotheus in return for his arrogance, and he never did anything great afterwards. But failing in all his undertakings and becoming odious to the people, he was at last banished from the city. But Sulla, by gladly accepting such felicitations on his prosperity and such admiration, and even contributing to strengthen these notions and to invest them with somewhat of a sacred character, made all his exploits depend on fortune. Whether it was that he did this for the sake of display or because he really had such opinions of the deity. Indeed, he has recorded in his memoirs that the actions which he resolved upon without deliberation and on the spur of the moment turned out more successfully than those which appeared to have been best considered. And again, from the passage in which he says that he was made more for fortune than for war, he appears to attribute more to fortune than to his merit, and to consider himself completely as the creature of the demon. Nay, he cites as a proof of good fortune due to the favor of the gods his harmony with Metellus, a man of the same rank with himself, and his father-in-law, for he expected that Metellus would cause him a good deal of trouble, whereas he was a most accommodating colleague. Further, in his memoirs which he dedicated to Lucullus, he advises him to think nothing so safe as what the demon enjoys during the night. When he was leaving the city with his troops for the social war, as he tells us in his memoirs, a great chasm opened in the earth near Liverna, from which a quantity of fire burst forth, and a bright flame rose like a column to the skies. The diviners said that a brave man, of an appearance different from and superior to ordinary men, would obtain the command and relieve the city from its present troubles. Sulla says this man was himself, for the golden color of his hair was a peculiarity in his personal appearance, and that he had no difference about bearing testimony to his own merits after so many illustrious exploits. So much as to his religious opinions. As to the other parts of his character, he was irregular and inconsistent. He would take away much and give more. He would confer honors without any good reason, and do a grievous wrong with just as little reason. He courted those whose assistance he wanted, and behaved with arrogance to those who wanted his aid, so that one could not tell whether he had naturally more haughtiness or subserviency. For as to his inconsistency in punishing, sometimes inflicting death for the slightest matters, and at others quietly bearing the greatest wrongs, his ready reconciliations with his deadly enemies, and his prosecution of slight and trifling offenses with death and confiscation of property, all this may be explained on the supposition that he was naturally of a violent and vindictive temper, but sometimes moderated his passion upon calculations of interest. During this social war, his soldiers killed with sticks and stones a man of praetorian rank, who was his legatus Albinus by name, an outrage which Sulla overlooked, and made no inquiry about. He went so far as to say, with apparent seriousness, that the soldiers would bestir themselves the more in the war and make amends for their fault by their courage. As to any blame that was imputed to him, he cared not for it, but having already formed the design of overthrowing the power of Marius and of getting himself appointed to the command against Mithridates, as the social war was now considered at an end, he endeavored to ingratiate himself with his army. On coming to Rome, he was elected consul, with Quintus Pompeius for his colleague, being now 50 years of age, and he formed a distinguished matrimonial alliance with Cecilia, the daughter of Metellus, the chief pontifex. This gave occasion to the populace to assail him with satirical songs, and many of the highest class were displeased at the marriage, as if they did not think him worthy of such a wife, whom they had judged to be worthy of the consulship, as Titus Livius remarks. Cecilia was not the only wife that Sulla had. When he was a very young man, he married Ilia, who bore him a daughter. His second wife was Aelia, and his third wife was Clolia, whom he divorced on the ground of barrenness, yet in a manner honorable to the lady, with an ample testimony to her virtues, and with presents. But as he married Metella a few days after, it was believed that his alleged ground of divorce was merely a pretext. However, he always paid great respect to Metella, which induced the Romans, when they wished to recall from exile the partisans of Marius, and Sulla refused his assent, to apply to Metellus to intercede for them. After the capture of Athens also, it was supposed that he treated the citizens with more severity, because they had cast aspersions upon Metella from their walls. But of this hereafter. 7. Sulla looked on the consulship as only a small matter compared with what he expected to attain. The great object of his desires was the command in the war against Mithridates. But he had a rival in Marius, who was moved by an insane love of distinction and by ambition, passions which never grow old in a man. For though he was now unwieldy, and had done no service in the late campaigns by reason of his age, he still longed for the command in a distant war beyond the seas. While Sulla was with the army completing some matters that still remained to be finished, Marius kept at home, and hatched that most pestilent faction, which did more mischief to Rome than all her wars. And indeed, the deity showed by signs what was coming. Fire spontaneously blazed from the wooden shafts which supported the military standards, and was quenched with difficulty. And 3 crows brought their young into the public road, and after devouring them, carried the fragments back to their nest. The mice in a temple gnawed the gold which was kept there, and the keeper of the temple caught one of the mice, a female, in a trap, which produced in the trap 5 young ones, and devoured 3 of them. But what was chief of all, from a cloudless and clear sky, there came the sound of a trumpet, so shrill and mournful, that by reason of the greatness thereof men were beside themselves and crouched for fear. The Tuscan seers interpreted this to portend the commencement of a new period and a general change. They say that there are, in all, 8 periods which differ in mode of life and habits altogether from one another, and to each period is assigned by the deity a certain number of years determined by the revolution of a great year. When a period is completed, the commencement of another is indicated by some wondrous sign on the earth, or from the heavens, so as to make it immediately evident to those who attend to such matters and have studied them, that men are now adopting other habits and modes of life, and are less or more an object of care to the gods than the men of former periods. They say, in the change from one period to another, there are great alterations, and that the art of the seer at one time is held in high repute, and is successful in its predictions, when the deity gives clear and manifest signs, but that in the course of another period the art falls into a low condition, being for the most part conjectural, and attempting to know the future by equivocal and misty signs. Now this is what the Tuscan wise men said, who are supposed to know more of such things than anybody else. While the Senate was communicating on these omens with the seers, in the temple of Bologna, a sparrow flew in before the whole body, with a grasshopper in his mouth, part of which he dropped, and the rest he carried off with him out of the place. From this the interpreters of omens apprehended faction and divisions between the landholders on the one side and the city folk and the merchant class on the other. For the latter were loud and noisy like a grasshopper, but the owners of land kept quiet on their estates. 8. Now Marius contrived to gain over the tribune Solpitius, a man without rival in any kind of villainy, and so one need not inquire whom he surpassed in wickedness, but only wherein he surpassed himself. For in him were combined cruelty, audacity, and rapaciousness, without any consideration of shame or of any crime, inasmuch as he sold the Roman citizenship to libertini and resident aliens, and publicly received the money at a table in the forum. He maintained 3,000 men armed with daggers, and also a number of young men of the equestrian class, always about him, and ready for anything, whom he called the opposition senate. He caused a law to be passed that no senator should contract debt to the amount of more than 2,000 drachmae, and yet at his death he left behind him a debt of 3 million. This man, being let loose upon the people by Marius, and putting everything into a state of confusion by violence and force of arms, framed various pernicious laws, and among them that which gave to Marius the command in the Mithridatic War. The consuls accordingly declared a cessation of all public business. But while they were holding a meeting of the people near the temple of Castor and Pollux, Solpitius with his rabble attacked them, and among many others massacred the youthful son of Pompeius in the Forum. Pompeius only escaped by hiding himself. Sulla was pursued into the house of Marius, from which he was compelled to come out and repeal the edict for the cessation of public business. And it was for this reason that Solpitius, though he deprived Pompeius of his office, did not take the consulship from Sulla, but merely transferred the command of the Mithridatic War to Marius, and sent some tribunes forthwith to Nola to take the army and lead it to Marius. 9. But Sulla made his escape to the camp before the tribunes arrived, and the soldiers, hearing of what had passed, stoned them to death, upon which the partisans of Marius murdered the friends of Sulla, who were in the city, and seized their property. This caused many persons to betake themselves to flight, some going to the city from the camp, and others from the camp to the city. The Senate was not its own master, but was compelled to obey the orders of Marius and Sulpicius. And on hearing that Sulla was marching upon Rome, they sent to him 2 of the praetors, Brutus and Servilius, to forbid him to advance any further. The praetors, who assumed a bold tone before Sulla, narrowly escaped being murdered. As it was, the soldiers broke their fasces, stripped them of their senatorial dress, and sent them back with every insult. It caused dejection in the city to see the praetors return without their insignia of office, and to hear them report that the commotion could not be checked, and was past all remedy. Now the partisans of Marius were making their preparations, while Sulla, with his colleague and 6 complete legions, was moving from Nola. He saw that the army was ready to march right to the city, but he had some hesitation himself, and feared the risk. However, upon Sulla making a sacrifice, the seer, Postumius, after inspecting the signs, stretched out his hands to Sulla, and urged him to put him in chains, and keep him a prisoner till the battle took place, declaring that if everything did not speedily turn out well, he was ready to be put to death. It is said also that Sulla in his sleep had a vision of the goddess, whose worship the Romans had learned from the Cappadocians, whatever her name may be, Selene, Athena, or Enyo. Sulla dreamed that the goddess stood by him and put a thunderbolt into his hand. And as she named each of his enemies, bade him dart the bolt at them, which he did, and his enemies were struck to the ground and destroyed. Being encouraged by the dream, which he communicated to his colleague, at daybreak Sulla led his forces against Rome. When he was near Picene, he was met by a deputation, which entreated him not to march forthwith against the city, for all justice would be done pursuant to a resolution of the Senate. Sulla consented to encamp there, and ordered the officers to measure out the ground for the encampment, according to the usual practice, and the deputation went away, trusting to his promise. But as soon as they were gone, Sulla sent Lucius Bacillus and Gaius Mummius, who seized the gate and that part of the walls which surrounds the Esquiline hill, and Sulla set out to join them with all speed. Bacillus and his soldiers broke into the city and attempted to gain possession of it, but the people, in large numbers being unarmed, mounted the housetops, and by pelting the soldiers with tiles and stones, stopped their further progress, and drove them back to the wall. In the meantime, Sulla had come up, and seeing how matters stood, he called out that the houses must be fired, and taking a flaming torch, he was the first to advance. He also ordered the bowmen to shoot firebrands and to aim at the roofs, in which he acted without any rational consideration, giving way to passion, and surrendering the direction of his enterprise to revenge, for he saw before him only his enemies, and without thought or pity for his friends and kinsmen, would force his way into Rome with the help of flames, which know no distinction between the guilty and the innocent. While this was going on, Marius, who had been driven as far as the Temple of Earth, invited the slaves to join him by offering them their freedom. But, being overpowered by his enemies who pressed on him, he left the city. 10. Sulla assembled the Senate, who condemned to death Marius and a few others, among whom was the tribune Solpitius. Solpitius was put to death, being betrayed by a slave, to whom Sulla gave his freedom, and then ordered him to be thrown down the Tarpeian rock. He set a price on the head of Marius, which was neither a generous nor a politic measure, as Marius had shortly before let Sulla off safe, when Sulla put himself into his power by going to the house of Marius. Now if Marius had not let Sulla go, but had given him up to Sulpicius to be put to death, he might have secured the supreme power. But he spared Sulla. And yet, a few days after, when Sulla had the same opportunity, Marius did not obtain from him a like return. The conduct of Sulla offended the Senate, though they durst not show it. But the dislike of the people and their dissatisfaction were made apparent to him by their acts. They contemptuously rejected Nonius, the son of Sulla's sister, and Servius, who were candidates for offices, and elected those whose elevation they thought would be most disagreeable to Sulla. But Sulla pretended to be pleased at this, and to view it as a proof that the people, by doing what they liked, were really indebted to him for their liberty. And for the purpose of diminishing his general unpopularity, he managed the election of Lucius Cinna, who was of the opposite faction to the consulship, having first bound him by solemn imprecations and oaths to favor his measures. Cinna ascended the Capitol with a stone in his hand and took the oath. Then, pronouncing an imprecation on himself that if he did not keep faithful to Sulla, he might be cast out of the city, as the stone from his hand, he hurled it to the ground in the presence of a large number of persons. But as soon as Cinna had received the consulship, he attempted to disturb the present settlement of affairs, and prepared to institute a process against Sulla, and induced Virginius, one of the tribunes, to be the accuser. But Sulla, without caring for him or the court, set out with his army against Mithridates. 11. It is said that about the time when Sulla was conducting his armament from Italy, many omens occurred to Mithridates, who was staying in Pergamum, and that a victory, bearing a crown, which the people of Pergamum were letting down upon him by some machinery from above, was broken in pieces, just as it was touching his head, and the crown, falling upon the theater, came to the ground and was destroyed, which made the spectators shudder, and greatly dispirited Mithridates, though his affairs were then going on favorably, beyond all expectation. For he had taken Asia from the Romans, and Bithynia and Cappadocia from their kings, and had fixed himself at Pergamum, where he was distributing wealth and provinces and kingdoms among his friends. One of his sons also held without any opposition the ancient dominions in Pontus and the Bosporus, as far as the uninhabited regions beyond the Myrtos. Ariarathes occupied Thrace and Macedonia with a large army, and his generals with their forces were subduing other places. Archelaus, the greatest of his generals, was master of all the sea with his navy, and was subjugating the Cyclades, and all other islands east of Malea, and had already taken Euboea, while with his army, advancing from Athens as his starting point, he was gaining over all the nations of Greece, as far north as Thessaly, and had only sustained a slight check near Chaeronea. For there he was met by Bruttius Sura, a legatus of Sentius, praetor of Macedonia, and a man of signal courage and prudence. Archelaus was sweeping through Boeotia like a torrent when he was vigorously opposed by Sura, who, after fighting 3 battles near Chaeronea, repulsed him and drove him back to the coast. On receiving orders from Lucius Lucullus to make room for Sola, who was coming, and to allow him to carry on the war, for which he had received his commission, Sura immediately left Boeotia and went back to Sentius, though he had succeeded beyond his expectations, and Greece was well disposed to change sides on account of his great merit. However, these exploits of Bruttius were very brilliant. 12. Now all the rest of the Grecian cities immediately sent deputations to Sola and invited him to enter. But against Athens, which was compelled by the tyrant Aristion to be on the king's side, he directed all his energies. He also hemmed in and blockaded the Piraeus, employing every variety of engine and every mode of attack. If he had waited a short time, he might have taken the upper city without danger, for through want of provisions it was reduced by famine to extreme necessity. But, anxious to return to Rome, and fearing a new revolution there, at great risk fighting many battles, and at great cost he urged on the war, wherein, besides the rest of the expenditure, the labor about the military engines required 10,000 pair of mules to be daily employed on this service. As wood began to fail, owing to many of the works being destroyed by their own weight, and burnt by the incessant fires thrown by the enemy, Sulla laid his hands on the several groves and leveled the trees in the Academia, which was the best wooded of the suburbs, and those in the Lyceum. And as he wanted money also for the war, he violated the sacred depositaries of Greece, sending for the finest and most costly of the offerings dedicated in Epidaurus and Olympia. He wrote also to the Amphictyons to Delphi, saying that it would be better for the treasure of the god to be brought to him, for he would either have them in safer keeping, or if he used them, he would replace them. And he sent one of his friends, Caphas, a Phocian, to receive all the things after they were first weighed. Caphas went to Delphi, but he was afraid to touch the sacred things, and, in the presence of the Amphictyons, he deeply lamented the task that was imposed on him. Upon some of them saying that they heard the lute in the shrine send forth a sound, Caphas, either believing what they said, or wishing to inspire Sulla with some religious fear, sent him this information. But Sulla replied in a scoffing tone. He wondered Caphas did not understand that such music was a sign of pleasure and not of anger, and he bade him take courage and seize the property, as the deity was quite willing, and in fact offered it. Now, all the things were secretly sent off unobserved by most of the Greeks, but the silver jar, one of the royal presents which still remained, could not be carried away by the beasts of burden, owing to its weight and size, and the Amphictyons were accordingly obliged to cut it in pieces. And this led them to reflect that Titus Flaminius and Manius Achilles, and also Aemilius Paulus, Achilles, who drove Antiochus out of Greece, and the 2 others who totally defeated the kings of Macedonia, not only refrained from touching the Greek temples, but even gave them presents and showed them great honor and respect. These generals, however, were legally appointed to command troops consisting of well-disciplined soldiers who had been taught to obey their leaders without a murmur. And the commanders themselves were men of kingly souls and moderate in their living, and satisfied with a small fixed expenditure. And they thought it baser to attempt to win the soldiers' favor than to fear their enemies. But the generals at this time, as they acquired their rank by violence and not by merit, and had more occasion to employ arms against one another than against the enemies of Rome, were compelled to act the demagogue while they were in command. And by purchasing the services of the soldiers by the money which they expended to gratify them, they made the Roman state a thing for bargain and sale, and themselves the slaves of the vilest wretches, in order that they might domineer over honest men. This is what drove Marius into exile, and then brought him back to oppose Sola. This made Cinna the murderer of Octavius, and Fimbria the murderer of Flaccus. And Sola mainly laid the foundation of all this by his profusion and expenditure upon his own soldiers, the object of which was to corrupt and gain over to his side the soldiers of other commanders, so that his attempts to seduce the troops of others and the extravagance by which his own soldiers were corrupted made money always necessary to him, and most particularly during the siege of Athens. 13. Now Sola was seized with a violent and irresistible desire to take Athens, whether it was that he was ambitious to contend against a city which retained only the shadow of its former glory, or that he was moved by passion to revenge the scoffs and jeers with which the tyrant Aristion irritated him and his wife Metella by continually taunting them from the wall and insulting them. This Aristion was a compound of lewdness and cruelty, who combined in himself all the worst of the vices and passions of Mithridates, and now had brought, as it were, a mortal disease in its last extremities upon a city which had come safe out of so many wars and escaped from so many tyrannies and civil commotions. For now, when a medimnus of wheat was selling for 1,000 drachmae in the upper city, and men were obliged to eat the parthenium that grew about the Acropolis, and shoes and oil flasks, he was drinking all day long, and amusing himself with revels and Pyrrhic dances, and making jokes at the enemy. He let the sacred light of the goddess go out for want of oil. When the Hierophant sent to ask for the 12th part of a medimnus of wheat, he sent her as much pepper. And when the members of the Senate and the priests entreated him to have pity on the city and come to terms with Sola, he dispersed them by ordering the archers to fire on them. At last, being persuaded with great difficulty, he sent 2 or 3 of his boon companions to treat of peace. But instead of making any reasonable proposals, the men began to make a pompous harangue about Theseus and Eumolpus and the Persian wars, on which Sola said, "Begone, my good fellows, with your fine talk. I was not sent to Athens by the Romans to learn a lesson, but to compel rebels to submit." 14. In the meantime, as the story goes, some soldiers in the Ceramicus overheard certain old men talking to one another and abusing the tyrant for not guarding the approach to the wall, about the Heptachalcum, which was the only part, they said, where it was practicable and easy for the enemy to get over. And the soldiers reported to Sola what they heard. Sola did not neglect the intelligence, but he went to the spot by night, and seeing that it was practicable, he set about the thing forthwith. He says in his memoirs that the first man who mounted the wall was Marcus Tius, who, finding a soldier in his way, struck him a violent blow on the helmet, which broke his sword. Still, Marcus did not retreat, but kept his ground. The city then was taken from this quarter, as the old Athenians said it might be. Sulla, having destroyed and leveled that part of the wall which lies between the Pyrrhic and the Sacred Gate, about midnight entered the city, striking terror with the sound of trumpets and horns, and the shouts and cries of the soldiers, who had his full license to plunder and kill, and made their way through the streets with naked swords. The slain were not counted, but the number is even now measured by the space over which the blood flowed. For besides those who were slaughtered in the other parts of the city, the blood of those who fell about the agora covered all the Ceramicus within Dipylum. Many say that it even flowed through the gates and deluged the suburbs. But though the number of those who perished by the sword was so great, as many killed themselves for sorrow and regret at the overthrow of their native city. For all the most honest citizens were driven to despair, expecting in Sulla neither humanity nor moderation. But however, when Midius and Caliphon, who were exiles, fell down at his knees with entreaties, and the senators who were in his army urged him to save the city, being now sated with vengeance, and passing some encomiums upon the ancient Athenians, he said he would pardon the many for the sake of the few, and the living for the sake of the dead. Sulla states in his memoirs that he took Athens on the calends of March, which day nearly coincides with the new moon of Anthesterion, in which month it happens that the Athenians perform many ceremonies in commemoration of the great damage and loss occasioned by the heavy rain, for they suppose that the deluge happened pretty nearly about that time. When the city was taken, the tyrant retreated to the Acropolis, where he was besieged by Curio, who was commissioned for this purpose. After he had held out for some time, Aristion was compelled to surrender for want of water. His surrender was immediately followed by a token from the deity, for on the very day and hour on which Curio took the tyrant from the Acropolis, the clouds gathered in the clear sky, and a violent shower descended, which filled the Acropolis with water. Sulla soon took the Piraeus also, and burnt the greater part of it, including the arsenal of Philo, which was a wonderful work. 15. In the meantime, Taxiles, the general of Mithridates, coming down from Thrace and Macedonia with 100,000 foot, 10,000 horse, and 90 scythe-bearing, 4-horse chariots, summoned Archelaus, who was still lying with his ships near Munychia, and was neither inclined to give up the sea, nor ready to engage with the Romans. His plan was to protract the war and to cut off the supplies of the enemy. But Sulla was as quick as Archelaus, and moved into Boeotia from a niggardly region, which even in time of peace could not have maintained his troops. Most people thought that he had made a false calculation in leaving Attica, which is a rough country and ill-adapted for the movements of cavalry, to throw himself into the campaign and open tracts of Boeotia, when he knew that the strength of barbarians lay in their chariots and cavalry. But in his flight from famine and scarcity, as I have already observed, he was compelled to seek the hazard of a battle. Besides, he was alarmed for Hortensius, a skillful general, and a man ambitious of distinction, who was conducting a force from Thessaly to Sulla, and had to pass through the straits, where the enemy was waiting for him. For all these reasons Sulla moved into Boeotia, but Caphas, who was from my town, evading the barbarians by taking a different route, from what they expected, led Hortensius over Parnassus, close by Tithera, which was not at that time so large a city as it is now, but only a fort on a steep rock scarped all round, to which place and time of old the Phocians who fled from Xerxes escaped with their property, and were there in safety. Hortensius, having encamped there during the day, repelled the attacks of the enemy, and at night descending to Patronus through a difficult path joined Sola, who met him with his forces. 16. Having united their forces, Sola and Hortensius occupied an elevation rising out of the midst of the plains of Elatia, which was fertile and extensive, and had water at its base. It is called Philobotus, and its natural qualities and position are most highly commended by Sola. When they were encamped, the weakness of the Roman force was apparent to the enemy, for the cavalry did not exceed 1,500, and the infantry was below 15,000. Accordingly, the rest of the generals, against the wish of Archelaus, drew out their forces in order of battle, and filled the plain with horses, chariots, shields, and bucklers. And the heavens could not contain the shouts and cries of so many nations putting themselves in battle array. At the same time, the pomp and costly splendor of the troops were not without effect, nor their use in causing alarm. But the glittering of the arms, which were curiously ornamented with gold and silver, and the color of the Median and Scythian dresses, mingled with the brightness of the brass and steel, produced a fire-like and formidable appearance, as the masses moved like waves and changed their places, so that the Romans hid themselves behind their ramparts, and Sola, being unable by any words to remove their fear, and not choosing to urge men to a battle who were disposed to run away, kept quiet, and had to endure the insulting boasts and ridicule of the barbarians. But this turned out most favorable to the Romans, for the enemy, despising them, neglected to preserve discipline, and indeed, owing to the number of commanders, the army was not generally inclined to obey orders. A few kept to their post within their ramparts, but the greater part, tempted by the hope of booty and plunder, were dispersed many days' journey from their camp. It is said that they destroyed the city of Panopeus and plundered Labadia and robbed the oracular shrine without any order from a general. Sola, who could not endure to see the cities destroyed before his eyes and was greatly irritated, no longer allowed his soldiers to be inactive, but, leading them to the Cephisus, he compelled them to divert the stream from its course and to dig ditches, allowing no man any cessation, and punishing most severely all who gave in, his object being to tire his soldiers with labor and to induce them to seek danger as a release from it. And it happened as he wished, for on the third day of this labor, as Sola was passing by, they entreated him with loud shouts to lead them against the enemy. He replied that they said this not because they wished to fight, but because they disliked labor. But if they really were disposed to fight, he bade them move forthwith with their arms to yonder place, pointing out to them what was formerly the Acropolis of the Peripatomi. But the city was then destroyed, and there remained only a rocky precipitous hill, separated from Mount Hedalium by the space occupied by the river Asus, which, falling into the Cephisus at the base of the Hedalium, and thus becoming a more rapid stream, makes the Acropolis a safe place for encampment. Sulla also wished to seize the height, as he saw the chacal speedus of the enemy pressing on towards it, and as his soldiers exerted themselves vigorously, he succeeded in occupying the place. Archelaus, being repelled from this point, advanced toward Chaeronea, upon which the men of Chaeronea, who were in Sulla's army, entreating him not to let their city fall into the hands of the enemy, he sent Gabinius a tribune with 1 legion, and permitted the men of Chaeronea to go also, who, though they had the best intention, could not reach the place before Gabinius. So brave a man he was, and more active in bringing aid than even those who prayed for it. Juba says it was not Gabinius who was sent, but Ericius. However this may be, our city had a narrow escape. 17. From Lebedea and the oracle of Trophonius, favorable omens and predictions of victory were sent to the Romans, about which the people of the country have a good deal to say. But Sola, in the 10th book of his memoirs, writes that Quintus Titius, a man of some note among those who had mercantile affairs in Greece, came to him immediately after the victory in Chaeronea to report that Trophonius foretold a second battle and victory there in a short time. After Titius, a soldier in his army named Salvinius brought an answer from the god as to what would be the result of affairs in Italy. Both reported the same as to the vision of the god. They said that in beauty and stature he was like the Olympian Jupiter. After crossing the Assus and advancing to the foot of Hedalium, Sulla encamped near Archelaus, who had thrown up a strong entrenchment between Mount Sacontium and Hedalium at a place called the Essia. The spot on which he encamped is called Archelaus from his name up to the present day. After the interval of 1 day, Sulla left Murena with 1 legion and 2 cohorts to annoy the enemy if he should attempt to form in order of battle. He himself sacrificed on the banks of the Cephisus, and the victims being favorable, he advanced towards Chaeronea, with the object of again effecting a junction with the forces there, and examining the place called Thurium, which was occupied by the enemy. This is a rough summit and a conical-shaped hill, named Orthophagus, and under it is the stream of the Morius and a temple of the Thurian Apollo. The deity has this name from Thuro, the mother of Charon, who is said to have been the founder of Chaeronea. Some say that the cow which was given by the Pythian Apollo as a guide to Cadmus appeared there, and that the place was so called from her. For the Phoenicians call the cow Thor. As Sulla was approaching Chaeronea, the tribune who was stationed in the city led out the soldiers under arms and met him with a chaplet of bay. No sooner had Sulla received the chaplet, and after saluting the soldiers, encouraged them to the approaching battle, than 2 Chaeronians, Homoloicus and Anaxidamos, presented themselves to him and undertook to drive the enemy from Thurium if he would give them a few soldiers. They said there was a path unknown to the barbarians, leading from the place called Petricus by the Museum to the highest point of Thurium, and that by taking this direction, they could without difficulty fall on the enemy and either roll stones down upon them from above or drive them into the plain. As Gabinius bore testimony to the courage and fidelity of the men, Sulla bade them make the attempt. And in the meantime he formed his line and distributed his cavalry on each flank, himself taking the right and giving Murena the command on the left. The legatii Galba and Hortensius, with some reserved cohorts in the rear, occupied the neighboring heights to prevent the army from being attacked on the flank, for it was observed that the enemy were placing a strong body of cavalry and light infantry on their wings, with the view of adapting that part of their battle to ready and easy maneuvers, their design being to extend their line and to surround the Romans. 18. In the meantime, the Charonnians, whom Sulla had placed under the command of Erechius, went round Thurium without being perceived, and all at once showed themselves to the enemy, who, immediately falling into great confusion, took to flight and sustained considerable loss, but chiefly from themselves. For as they did not stand their ground, but ran down the hill, they got entangled among their own spears, and shoved one another down the rocks, while the Charonnians, pressing upon them from above, wounded them in the parts which were unprotected. And there fell of the enemy to the number of 3,000. Part of those who got safe to the foot of the hill, being met by Murena, whose troops were already in order of battle, had their retreat cut off and were destroyed. The rest forced their way to the army of Archelaus, and falling upon the line in disorder caused a general alarm and confusion, and some loss of time to the generals, and this did them no small harm, for Sulla promptly led his forces against the enemy, while they were still in disorder, and by quickly traversing the interval between the two lines, deprived the scythe-bearing chariots of all opportunity of being effective. The efficacy of the chariots depends mainly on the space they traverse, by which they acquire velocity and momentum. But when the space is small, their attack is ineffectual and feeble, just like missiles that have not been propelled with due force. Now this happened to the barbarians. The first chariots were driven on without any vigor, and came feebly against the ranks of the Romans, who easily pushed them aside, and clapping their hands and laughing, called for more, as the people do in the horse races of the circus. Upon this, the infantry joined battle. The barbarians pushed forward their long spears, and endeavored by locking their shields to maintain their ranks in line. The Romans hurled their javelins, and then, drawing their swords, endeavored to beat aside the spears, that they might forthwith close with the enemy. For they were irritated at seeing drawn up in front of the enemy 15,000 slaves, whom the king's generals had invited from the cities by a proclamation of freedom, and enrolled among the hoplite. A Roman centurion is said to have remarked that slaves had only freedom of speech at the Saturnalia, so far as he knew. Now, owing to the depth of the ranks of these slaves and their close order, it was some time before they could be made to give way before the heavy-armed Roman soldiers, and they also fought with more courage than one expects from a slave. But the missiles from the slings and the light javelins which were showered upon them unsparingly by the Romans in the rear, at last made them turn and put them into complete confusion. 19. While Archelaus was extending his right wing in order to surround the Romans, Hortensius made his cohorts advance at a run, with the intention of taking the enemy in the flank. But as Archelaus suddenly wheeled round with his 2,000 horsemen, Hortensius was overpowered by numbers and retreated towards the mountain region, being gradually separated from the main body of the army and in danger of being completely hemmed in by the barbarians. Sulla, who was on the right wing, which was not yet engaged in the action, hearing of the danger of Hortensius, hastened to relieve him. Archelaus, conjecturing from the dust raised by Sulla's troops how the matter was, left Hortensius, and wheeling round, moved towards the position which Sulla had quitted, the right, expecting to find the soldiers there without their general and to defeat them. At the same time, Taxiles led the Chalcaspides against Murena, and now the shouts being raised from both armies and re-echoed by the mountains, Sulla halted and hesitated to which quarter he should move. Having determined to maintain his own original position, he sent Hortensius with 4 cohorts to support Murena, and, ordering the 5th to follow him, he hurried to the right wing, which unaided was bravely resisting Archelaus. But as soon as Sulla appeared, the Romans completely broke the line of Archelaus and pursued the barbarians in disorderly flight to the river and Mount Acontium. However, Sulla did not leave Murena alone in his dangerous position, but hastened to help him. Seeing, however, that the Romans were victorious here also, he joined in the pursuit. Now many of the barbarians were cut down in the plain, but the greatest number were destroyed in the attempt to regain their entrenchments, and only 10,000 out of so large a host made their escape to Chalcis. Sulla says in his memoirs that he missed only 14 of his own soldiers, and that 10 of them showed themselves in the evening, in commemoration of which he inscribed on the trophies Mars in victory and Venus, to signify that he had gained the victory no less through good fortune than skill and courage. One of these trophies, which commemorates the victory in the plain, stands where the soldiers of Archelaus first gave ground, in the flight to the Molus. The other is placed on the summit of Thurian, to commemorate the surprise of the barbarians, which a Greek inscription in honor of the courage of Homoloicus and Anaxidamus. Sulla celebrated the festival for the victory in Thebes at the Fountain of Oedipus, where he erected a stage. The judges were Greeks invited from the other cities of Greece, for Sulla could not be reconciled to the Thebans, and he took from them half of their lands, which he dedicated to the Pythian Apollo and Olympian Jupiter. And from the revenue of these lands he ordered the sums of money which he had taken from them to be repaid to the deities. 20. After the battle, Sulla received intelligence that Flaccus, who belonged to the opposite faction, was chosen consul, and was crossing the Ionian Sea with a force which was said to be designed against Mithridates, but was in fact directed against himself. And accordingly, he advanced towards Thessalia to meet Flaccus. He had advanced to the neighborhood of Melitia when reports from all sides reached him that the country in his rear was ravaged by another army of Mithridates as numerous as that which he had dispersed. Dorylus had landed at Chalcis with a large navy, on board of which he brought 80,000 men of the best trained and disciplined troops of Mithridates, and he immediately advanced into Boeotia and occupied the country, being eager to draw Sulla to an engagement, and paying no regard to Archelaus, who dissuaded him from fighting. He even said publicly that so many thousands could never have been destroyed if there had not been treachery. However, Sulla, who quickly returned to Boeotia, showed Dorylus that Archelaus was a prudent man and had formed a very just estimate of the courage of the Romans. For after a slight skirmish with Sulla, near Telphosium, Dorylas was himself the first among those who were not for deciding the matter by a battle, but thought it best to prolong the war till the Romans should be exhausted by want of supplies. However, Archelaus was somewhat encouraged by the position of their encampment near Orchomenus, which was very favorable for battle to an army which had the superiority in cavalry. For of all the plains in Boeotia, noted for their beauty and extent, this, which commences at the city of Orchomenus, is the only one which spreads without interruption and without any trees, and it reaches to the marshes in which the river Melas is lost. The Melas rises close to Orchomenus and is the only river of Greece that is a copious and navigable stream at its source. It also increases like the Nile about the summer solstice, and the same plants grow on its banks, but they produce no fruit and do not attain any large size. Its course, however, is short, for the larger part of the water is soon lost in obscure marshes overgrown with shrubs. A small part joins the Cephisus somewhere about the point where the lake is said to produce the reed that is adapted for making musical pipes. 21. The two armies being encamped near one another, Archelaus kept quiet, but Sulla began to dig trenches on both sides of the view, if possible, of cutting off the enemy from the hard ground and those parts which were favorable to cavalry, and driving them into the marshes. However, the barbarians would not endure this, and as soon as their generals allowed them to attack the Romans, they rushed forward with so much vigor and force that not only were the men dispersed who were working at the trenches, but the greater part of the Roman troops that were drawn up for their protection were involved in the fight. Upon this, Sulla leapt down from his horse, and snatching up a standard, made his way through the fugitives towards the enemy, crying out, "For my part, Romans, it is fit I should die here. As for you, when you are asked where you deserted your imperator, remember to say, 'It was in Orchomenus.'" These words made the soldiers rally, and two cohorts came to their support from the right wing, which Sulla led against the enemy, and put them to flight. He then led his soldiers back a short distance, and after allowing them to take some food, he began again to work at the trenches, which were designed to enclose the enemy's camp. The barbarians made another attack in better order than before, in which Diogenes, the son of the wife of Archelaus, fell fighting bravely on the right wing. And the bowmen, being hard pressed by the Romans and having no means of retreat, took their arrows altogether in their hands, and using them like swords, struck at the Romans. But at last they were driven back to their camp, where they spent a wretched night owing to their wounds and great losses. As soon as day dawned, Sulla again led his soldiers up to the enemy's encampment, and again commenced working at the ditches. The enemy came out in a great force, but Sulla put them to flight, and as no one stood his ground after they were thrown into disorder, Sulla stormed the camp. The swamps and the lake were filled with the blood and bodies of those who fell, and even to the present day, many barbarian bows, helmets, and pieces of iron, cuirasses, and swords are found buried in the marshes, though it is near 200 years since the battle. Such, according to the historians, was the battle about Chaeronea and near Orchomenus. 22. Cinna and Carbo were now conducting themselves towards the chief men at Rome in an illegal and violent manner, and many flying from their tyranny resorted to the camp of Sola as a harbor of refuge, so that in a short time a kind of senate was formed about him. Metella also, who had with difficulty escaped with her children, came and reported that his house and farms were burnt by his enemies, and she entreated him to go to the assistance of his friends at Rome. Sulla was perplexed what to do. He could not endure the thoughts of neglecting his country in her present oppressed condition, nor did he see how he could leave so great an undertaking as the Mithridatic War imperfect. In the meantime, there came to him a merchant of Delos, named Archelaus, who secretly brought from Archelaus, the king's general, hopes of peace and certain proposals. Sulla was so well pleased that he was eager for an interview with Archelaus, and they met at Delium on the seacoast, where the temple of Apollo is. Archelaus, who began the conference, urged Sulla to give up Asia and the Pontus, and to sail to Rome to prosecute the war against his enemies, and he offered him money, ships, and troops on behalf of the king. Sulla, in reply, advised Archelaus not to trouble himself any further about Mithridates, but to assume the kingly title himself, and to become an ally of Rome, and to give up the ships of Mithridates. As Archelaus professed his detestation of such treachery, Sulla said, "You then, Archelaus, who are a Cappadocian and the slave of a barbarian king, or if you please his friend, you refuse to do a base deed for so splendid a reward, and yet venture to talk about treachery to me, who am a Roman general, and am Sulla, as if you were not that Archelaus, who fled from Chaeronea with a few men out of your 120,000, and were hid for 2 days in the marshes of Orchomenus, and left Boeotia with all the roads made impassable by the heaps of dead." Upon this Archelaus changed his tone, and humbling himself, entreated Sulla to give up the war and to come to terms with Mithridates. Sulla accepted the proposal, and peace was made on the following terms. Mithridates was to give up Asia and Paphlagonia, and to surrender Bithynia to Nicomedes, and Cappadocia to Ariobarzanes, to pay down to the Romans 2,000 talents, and to give them 70 ships, fitted with brass and completely equipped. Sulla was to confirm Mithridates in the rest of his possessions, and to recognize him as an ally of the Romans. 23. These terms being settled, Sulla retraced his steps and marched through Thessaly and Macedonia to the Hellespont, in company with Archelaus, whom he treated with great respect. Archelaus fell dangerously ill at Larissa, on which Sulla stopped his march, and paid as much attention to him as if he had been one of his own officers and fellow generals. This gave rise to some suspicion that the Battle of Chaeronea was not fairly fought, which was strengthened by the fact that Sulla restored all the friends of Mithridates whom he had taken prisoners, except Aristion the tyrant, who was an enemy of Archelaus, and whom he caused to be poisoned. But the most convincing proof of all was Sulla's giving the Cappadocian 10,000 plethra of land in Euboea, and the title of friend and ally of the Romans. However, Sulla makes his apology about these matters in his memoirs. Ambassadors from Mithridates now arrived, and were ready to accede to all the terms agreed on, except that the king would not consent to give up Paphlagonia. And as to the ships he dissented altogether, on which Sulla in a passion exclaimed, "What say ye? Mithridates claims to keep Paphlagonia, and refuses to abide by the agreement about the ships. I thought he would have been thankful if I left him his right hand, which has destroyed so many Romans. However, he will soon speak another language when I have crossed over to Asia. At present, let him stay in Pergamum, and there direct the conduct of a campaign which he has not seen." The ambassadors were so much alarmed that they said nothing, but Archelaus implored Sulla and tried to soften his anger, clinging to his hands with tears in his eyes. At last he prevailed on Sulla to let him go to Mithridates, and he promised to effect a peace on Sulla's own terms or to kill himself. Sulla accordingly sent Archelaus to Mithridates, and in the meantime he invaded Mytice, and having ravaged the greater part of it, returned to Macedonia, and found Archelaus at Philippi, who reported that all was favorable, but that Mithridates much wished to have an interview with him. Mithridates was mainly induced to this by the circumstance that Fimbria, after murdering the consul Flaccus, who belonged to the opposite faction, and defeating the generals of Mithridates, was advancing against the king himself. It was fear of Fimbria that made Mithridates more inclined to make a friend of Sulla. 24. Accordingly, they met at Dardanus in the Troad. Mithridates had there 200 rowing ships, 20,000 heavy-armed soldiers, 6,000 horsemen, and many of his scythe-bearing chariots. Sulla had 4 cohorts and 200 horsemen. Mithridates advanced to meet Sulla and held out his hand, on which Sulla asked him if he would put an end to the war on the terms agreed to by Archelaus. As the king made no reply, Sulla said, "Well, those who sue must speak first. Conquerors may remain silent." Mithridates began an apology, in which he partly imputed the origin of the war to the deities, and partly threw the blame on the Romans. But Sulla cut him short by saying that he had long ago been told, and now he knew by his own experience, that Mithridates was a most skillful speaker, inasmuch as he had no difficulty in finding words to justify acts which were so base and so contrary to all right. Sulla went on to recapitulate all that Mithridates had done, reproaching him in bitter terms, and he then asked him again if he would abide by the agreement of Archelaus. Mithridates said that he would, on which Sulla embraced him, threw his arms round him and kissed him, and then brought forward the kings, Ariobarzanes and Nicomedes, and reconciled Mithridates to them. After surrendering to Sulla 70 ships and 500 bowmen, Mithridates sailed off to the Pontus. Sulla perceived that his soldiers were dissatisfied at the settlement of the war. They thought it a shame that the greatest enemy of the Romans, who had contrived the massacre of 150,000 Romans in Asia in one day, should be seen sailing off with the wealth and the spoils of Asia, which he had been plundering and levying contributions on for 4 years. Sulla apologized to the soldiers by saying that he should not be able to oppose both Fimbria and Mithridates if they were united against him. 25. From Dardanus, Sulla marched against Fimbria, who was encamped near Thyatira, and halting there, began to throw up his entrenchments. Fimbria's men, coming out of their camp in their jackets, embraced the soldiers of Sola, and began to assist them zealously in their works. Fimbria, seeing that his soldiers had deserted him, and fearing Sola's unforgiving temper, committed suicide in the camp. Sola now levied a contribution on Asia to the amount of 20,000 talents, and he reduced individuals to beggary by the violence and exactions which he permitted to the soldiers who were quartered in their houses. He issued an order that the master of a house should daily supply the soldier who was quartered on him with 4 tetradrachmae, and with dinner for himself and as many of his friends as he chose to invite. A centurion was to receive 50 drachmae daily, and to be supplied with 2 garments, one to wear in the house and the other when he went abroad. 26. Sola set sail for Ephesus with all his ships, and on the 3rd day anchored in the Piraeus. After being initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, he appropriated to himself the library of Apellicon of Teos, which contained most of the writings of Aristotle and Theophrastus. The works of these 2 philosophers were not then well known to people in general. It is said that when the library was brought to Rome, Tyrannio, the grammarian, arranged most of the books, and that Andronicus of Rhodes, having procured copies of Tyrannio, published them, and made the tables which are now in use. It appears that the older Peripatetics were indeed well-instructed men, and devoted to letters, but they did not possess many of the writings of Aristotle and Theophrastus, nor yet correct copies, owing to the circumstances that the books came into the hands of the heirs of Neleus of Skepsis, to whom Theophrastus bequeathed them, and that they were ignorant persons who never troubled themselves about such matters. While Sola was staying at Athens, he was seized with a numbness in his feet, accompanied with a feeling of heaviness, which Strabo calls a stammering of gout. Accordingly, he crossed the sea to Edipsus, where he used the warm springs, at the same time indulging in relaxation, and spending all his time in the company of actors. As he was walking about on the seashore, some fishermen presented him with some very fine fish. Sola was much pleased with the present, but on hearing that the men belonged to Heliae, he said, "What, is there a Helian still alive?" For it happened that while pursuing his enemies before the victory at Orchomenus, he destroyed at once 3 Boeotian cities, Anthedon, Larimna, and Haliae. The men were struck speechless with fear, but Sola, with a smile, bade them go away in good heart, for the intercessors they had brought were no mean ones, and not to be despised. Upon this, the Helians say they took courage, and again occupied their city. 27. Sola went through Thessaly and Macedonia to the seacoast, where he made preparations to cross from Dyrrachium to Brundisium with 1,200 ships. Near to Dyrrachium is Apollonia, and near to Apollonia is the Nymphaeum, a sacred spot where perpetual streams of fire rise in various places out of a green grassy valley. It is said that a sleeping satyr was caught there, such a one as sculptors and painters represent, and was brought to Sola and questioned by many interpreters as to who he was, but he spoke with difficulty, and what he did utter was unintelligible, and something like a compound of the neighing of a horse and the bleating of a goat, upon which Sola, who was startled at the monster, ordered him to be removed. Sola was now about to take his soldiers over the sea, but he feared that when they landed in Italy, they would disperse to their several cities. However, the soldiers voluntarily took an oath to abide by him, and not to do any damage in Italy from set design. Seeing also that he required much money, they all contributed something from what they had, each according to his means. However, Sola would not receive the contribution, but after commending their zeal and encouraging them, he proceeded to cross the sea, as he expresses it in his memoirs, to oppose 15 hostile commanders at the head of 450 cohorts. The deity gave him some prognostics of success, for upon his sacrificing immediately on landing in Italy, near Tarentum, the liver of the animal was found to have on it the figure of a crown of bay, with 2 ribbons attached to it. A short time, also before he crossed the sea, 2 large he-goats were seen in Campania, near Mount Hephaeus, in the daytime, fighting, and in all respects acting like men engaged in a contest. But it was only a vision, and it gradually rose up from the ground and dispersed in the air, in various directions like dark phantoms, and finally disappeared. No long time after, in this very spot, when the younger Marius and the consul Norbanus came upon him at the head of a large force, Sola, without having time to form his battle or to dispose his companies, but merely availing himself of the spirit that animated all his men and their impetuous courage, put to flight his opponents and shut Norbanus up in Capua with the loss of 7,000 of his soldiers. It was this success, as some say, which prevented his soldiers from dispersing to their several cities, and encouraged them to stay with Sola and to despise their opponents. Though many times more numerous than themselves. At Silvium, as Sola says, a slave of one Pontius, moved by a divine impulse, met him and declared that he brought from Bologna assurance of superiority in war and victory, but that if he did not make haste, the capital would be burnt. And this is said to have happened on the very day which the man foretold, being the day before the nones of Quintilis, which we now call July. Further, Marcus Lucullus, one of Sola's commanders, was opposed at Fidentia with 16 cohorts to 50 of the enemy. And though he had confidence in the spirit of his men, he was discouraged because a greater part of them were unarmed. While he was considering and hesitating what to do, a gentle breeze blowing from the adjoining plain, which was covered with grass, carried many of the flowers to the army of Lucullus and spontaneously strewed them about, so that they rested and fell on the men's shields and helmets, which seemed to their opponents to be crowned with chaplets. Thus encouraged, the soldiers of Lucullus engaged and gained a victory, with the loss to the opposite party of 18,000 men and their camp. This Lucullus was the brother of the Lucullus who afterwards defeated Mithridates and Tigranes. 28. Sola, perceiving that he was still surrounded by many hostile camps and large forces, treacherously invited Scipio, one of the consuls, to come to terms. Scipio accepted the proposal, which was followed by many meetings and conferences, but Sola continually threw impediments and pretexts in the way of a final agreement, and in the meantime he corrupted Scipio's soldiers by means of his own men, who were as practiced in all kinds of deceit and fraud as their commander. Going within the entrenchments of Scipio and mingling with his soldiers, they gained over some by giving them money, others by promises, and the rest by flattery and persuasion. At last, Sulla with 20 cohorts approached the camp of Scipio, and his soldiers saluted those of Scipio, who returned the salute and came over to them. Scipio, thus deserted, was taken prisoner in his tent, but set at liberty. And Sulla, with the 20 cohorts, like so many tame birds, having entrapped 40 of the enemy, led them all back to his camp. On this occasion, it is said, Carbo observed that he had to contend in Sulla both with a lion and a fox, but the fox gave him most trouble. After this, in the neighborhood of Signia, Marius, at the head of 84 cohorts, challenged Sulla to battle. And Sulla was very ready for the contest on that day, for he happened to have had a vision in his sleep of this sort. He dreamed that the elder Marius, who had long been dead, was advising his son to beware of the following day, as it would bring him heavy misfortune. This was the reason that Sulla was eager to fight, and he sent for Dolabella, who was encamped at some distance. But as the enemy occupied the roads and cut off the communications, the soldiers of Sulla were wearied with fighting and working at the roads at the same time. And it happened that much rain also fell, and added to the fatigue of their labor. Upon this, the centurions coming up to Sulla begged him to defer the battle, and pointed out to him that the soldiers were exhausted by fatigue, and were lying on the ground with their shields under them. Sulla consented unwillingly, and gave orders for the army to halt there. But while they were beginning to throw up their rampart and dig their trenches, Marius advanced against them confidently at the head of his troops, expecting to disperse them in their state of disorder and confusion. Now the daimon made good the words that Sulla heard in his dream, for his soldiers, transported with indignation and stopping their work, fixed their spears in the ground close to the trenches, and drawing their swords with a loud shout, were forthwith at close quarters with the enemy. The soldiers of Marius did not stand their ground long, and there was a great slaughter of them in their flight. Marius, who fled to Praeneste, found the gates closed, but a rope being let down from the walls, he fastened himself to it, and was drawn up into the city. Some historians say, and Fenestella among them, that Marius saw nothing of the battle, but that being exhausted by want of sleep and fatigue, he lay down on the ground in the shade, and as soon as the signal was given for battle, fell asleep, and that he was roused with difficulty when the flight began. Sulla says that he lost only 23 men in this battle, and that he killed of the enemy 20,000 and took 8,000 alive. He was equally successful everywhere else through his generals Pompeius, Crassus, Metellus, Servilius. For without sustaining any but the most trifling loss, they destroyed the great armies of their opponents. And at last, Carbo, who was the main support of the opposite party, stole away from his troops by night and sailed to Libya. 29. In the last struggle, however, like a fresh combatant attacking an exhausted athlete, Telesinus, the Samnite, was very near tripping up Sulla and laying him prostrate at the gates of Rome. Telesinus was hastening with Lamponius, the Lucanian, and a strong force to Praeneste in order to rescue Marius, who was besieged. But finding that Sulla in his front and Pompeius in his rear were coming against him, and that he could neither advance nor retreat, like a brave and experienced man, he broke up his encampment by night, and marched with all his force against Rome. And indeed, he was very near surprising the city, which was unguarded. However, halting about 10 stadia from the Colline Gate, he passed the night there, full of confidence and elated with hope, as he had got the advantage over so many great generals. At daybreak, the most distinguished young men came out on horseback to oppose him, but many of them fell, and among them Claudius Appius, a man of noble rank and good character. This naturally caused confusion in the city, and there were women shrieking and people hurrying in all directions in expectation that the city was going to be stormed, when Balbus appeared first, coming at full speed from Sola with 700 horsemen. Balbus just halted long enough to allow his men to dry the sweat from their horses. Then, bridling them again, they advanced quickly and engaged with the enemy. In the meantime, Sola also appeared, and ordering the advanced ranks to take some refreshment, he began to put them in order of battle. Dolabella and Torquatus earnestly entreated him to pause and not to put all to the hazard with his exhausted soldiers. They said the contest was not with Carbo and Marius, but with Samnites and Lucanians, the most deadly and warlike enemies of Rome. But Sola, without paying any regard to them, ordered the trumpets to sound the charge, though it was now about the 10th hour. The battle began, and was fiercer than any that was fought in this campaign. The right wing, where Crassus commanded, was completely successful, but the left was hard pressed, and in a dangerous plight when Sulla came to its support, mounted on a very spirited and fleet white horse, by which he was easily distinguished from the rest, and two of the enemy's soldiers, fixing their javelins, prepared to aim at him. Sulla did not see them, but his groom whipped the horse, which just carried his rider, so far out of the reach of the spears that they passed close to the horse's tail, and stuck in the ground. It is said that Sulla always carried about with him in his bosom in battle a small golden figure of Apollo, which he got from Delphi, and that he then kissed it and said, "O Pythian Apollo, after raising the fortunate Sulla Cornelius in so many contests to glory and renown, wilt thou throw him prostrate here, at the gates of his native city, and so bring him to perish most ignobly with his fellow citizens?" After this address to the god, it is said that Sulla entreated some, and threatened and laid hold of others. But at last, the left wing being completely broken, he was mingled with the fugitives, and made his escape to the camp, with the loss of many of his friends and men of note. Not a few of the citizens also, who had come to see the fight, were killed and trampled down, so that it was thought all was over with the city, and the blockade of Marius was all but raised, for many of the fugitives made their way to Praeneste, and urged Ofella Lucretius, who had been appointed to conduct the siege, to break up his quarters with speed, as Sulla was killed, and Rome in the possession of the enemy. 30. It was now far on in the night when men came to Sulla's camp from Crassus to get something to eat for him and his soldiers, for after putting the enemy to flight they had pursued them to Antemne, and there encamped. Upon this intelligence, and that most of the enemy were killed, Sulla came to Antemne at daybreak. Here 3,000 soldiers sent to him to propose to surrender, and Sulla promised them their lives if they would punish the rest of his enemies before they joined him. Trusting to his promise, these men attacked their comrades, and a great number on both sides were cut to pieces. However, Sulla got together the soldiers who had offered to surrender and those who had survived the massacre, to the number of 6,000 in the circus, and at the same time he summoned the Senate to the Temple of Bologna. As soon as he began to speak, the men who were appointed to do the work began to cut down the 6,000 men. A cry naturally arose from so many men being butchered in a narrow space, and the senators were startled. But Sulla, preserving the same unmoved expression of countenance, bade them attend to what he was saying, and not trouble themselves about what was going on outside. It was only some villains who were being punished by his orders. This made even the dullest Roman see that there was merely an exchange of tyrants, not a total change. Now Marius was always cruel, and he grew more so, and the possession of power did not change his disposition. But Sulla at first used his fortune with moderation and like a citizen of a free state, and he got the reputation of being a leader who, though attached to the aristocratical party, still regarded the interests of the people. Besides this, he was from his youth fond of mirth, and so soft to pity as to be easily moved to tears. It was not without reason, then, that his subsequent conduct fixed on the possession of great power the imputation that it does not let men's tempers abide by their original habits, but makes them violent, vain, and inhuman. Now, whether fortune really produces an alteration and change in a man's natural disposition, or whether, when he gets to power, his bad qualities hitherto concealed are merely unveiled, is a matter that belongs to another subject than the present. 31. Sulla now began to make blood flow, and he filled the city with deaths without number or limit. Many persons were murdered on grounds of private enmity, who had never had anything to do with Sulla, but he consented to their death to please his adherents. At last, a young man, Gaius Metellus, had the boldness to ask Sulla in the Senate House when there would be an end to these miseries, and how far he would proceed before they could hope to see them stop. "We are not deprecating," he said, "your vengeance against those whom you have determined to put out of the way, but we entreat you to relieve from uncertainty those whom you have determined to spare." Sulla replied that he had not yet determined whom he would spare. "Tell us then," said Metellus, "whom you intend to punish." Sulla said that he would. Some say that it was not Metellus but Aufidius, one of Sulla's flatterers, who made use of the last expression. Sulla immediately prescribed 80 persons without communicating with any magistrate. As this caused a general murmur, he let one day pass, and then prescribed 220 more, and again on the third day as many. In a harangue to the people, he said, with reference to these measures, that he had prescribed all he could think of, and as to those who now escaped his memory, he would prescribe them at some future time. It was part of the prescription that every man who received and protected a prescribed person should be put to death for his humanity, and there was no exception for brothers, children, or parents. The reward for killing a prescribed person was 2 talents, whether it was a slave who killed his master or a son who killed his father. But what was considered most unjust of all, he affixed infamy on the sons and grandsons of the proscribed and confiscated their property. The proscriptions were not confined to Rome. They extended to every city of Italy. Neither temple nor hospitable hearth nor father's house was free from murder, but husbands were butchered in the arms of their wives, and children in the embrace of their mothers. The number of those who were massacred through revenge and hatred was nothing compared with those who were murdered for their property. It occurred even to the assassins to observe that the ruin of such a one was due to his large house, another man owed his death to his orchard, and another again to his warm baths. Quintus Aurelius, a man who never meddled with public affairs, and though he was no further concerned about all these calamities, except so far as he sympathized with the sufferings of others, happened to come to the forum, and there he read the names of the proscribed. Finding his own name among them, he exclaimed, "Alas, wretch that I am, 'tis my farm at Alba that is my persecutor." He had not gone far before he was murdered by someone who was in search of him. 32. In the meantime, Marius killed himself to avoid being taken. Sola now went to Praeneste, and he began by examining the case of each individual before he punished him. But having no time for this inquiry, he had all the people brought to one spot, to the number of 12,000, and ordered them to be massacred, with the exception of one man, an old friend of his, whom he offered to pardon. But the man nobly declared he would never owe his safety to the destroyer of his country, and mingling with the rest of the citizens, he was cut down together with them. The affair of Lucius Catilina was perhaps the most monstrous of all. Lucius had murdered his brother before the termination of the war, and he asked Sola to proscribe him among the rest as if he were still alive, which was done. To show his gratitude, Catilina killed one Marcus Marius, who belonged to the opposite faction, and after bringing his head to Sola, who was then sitting in the forum, he went to the temple of Apollo, which was close by, and washed his hands in the sacred font. 33. Besides the massacres, there were other things to cause dissatisfaction. Sola had himself proclaimed dictator, and thus revived this office after an interval of 120 years. An act of indemnity was also passed for all that he had done. For the future, it was enacted that he should have power of life and death, and should confiscate property, distribute lands, found colonies, destroy them, take away kingdoms, and give them to whom he pleased. The sales of confiscated property were conducted by him from his tribunal in such an arrogant and tyrannical manner that his mode of dealing with the produce of the sales was more intolerable than the seizure of the property. He gave away to handsome women, players on the lyre, mimi, and worthless libertini the lands of whole nations and the revenues of cities. To some men he gave wives who were compelled to marry against their will. Wishing to form an alliance with Pompeius Magnus, he made him put away his wife, and he took Aemilia, who was the daughter of Scaurus and of his own wife Metella, from her husband, Manius Glabrio, though she was then with child, and married her to Pompeius. Aemilia died in the house of Pompeius in childbirth. Lucretius Ofella, who had taken Praeneste, became a candidate for the consulship, and canvassed for it. Sola at first attempted to stop him, but on Lucretius entering the forum, supported by a large party, Sola sent one of his centurions to kill Lucretius, himself the while sitting on his tribunal in the temple of Castor and Pollux, and looking down upon the murder. The bystanders seized the centurion and brought him before the tribunal. But Sola, bidding them stop their noise, declared that he had ordered the centurion to kill Lucretius, and they must let him go. 34. The triumph of Sola was magnificent for the splendor and rarity of the regal spoils, but the exiles formed a greater ornament to it and a noble spectacle. The most illustrious and wealthy of the citizens followed in the procession with chaplets on their heads, calling Sola their savior and father, inasmuch as through him they were restored to their country, their children, and their wives. When the triumph was over, Sola, before the assembled people, gave an account of all the events of his life, mentioning with equal particularity his good fortune and his great deeds, and in conclusion, he bade them salute him, by the name of Eutyches, for this is the nearest word to express the Latin Felix. And when he wrote to Greeks or had any business to transact with them, he called himself Epaphroditus. In our country also, on the trophies of Sola, there is the inscription, Lucius Cornelius Sulla Epaphroditus. As Metella bore him twins, Sulla named the male Faustus and the female Fausta, for the Romans apply the name Faustus to what is fortunate and gladsome. Sulla indeed trusted so far to his good fortune, rather than to his acts, that though he had put many persons to death and had made so many innovations and changes in the state, he laid down the dictatorship and allowed the people to have the full control of the consular elections without going near them, and all the while walking about in the forum and exposing himself to anyone who might choose to call him to account, just like a private person. Contrary to Sulla's wish, a bold man and an enemy of his was likely to be elected consul, Marcus Lepidus, not for his own merits, but because the people wished to please Pompeius, who was earnest in his support and canvassed for him. Sulla, seeing Pompeius going home, well pleased with his victory, called him to him and said, "What a fine piece of policy is this of yours, young man, for Lepidus to be proclaimed consul before Catulus, the most violent in preference to the most honorable of men. It is, however, time for you not to be asleep, as you have strengthened your rival against yourself." Sulla said this in a kind of prophetic tone, for Lepidus soon broke out in great excesses and was at war with Pompeius. 35. Sulla made an offering of the 10th part of his substance to Hercules, and feasted the people magnificently. So much greater indeed was the preparation than what was required, that a great quantity of provisions was daily thrown into the river, and wine was drunk 40 years old, and even older. In the midst of the entertainment, which lasted several days, Metella died. As the priests would not allow Sulla to go to her, or his house to be polluted by a dead body, Sulla sent Metella a writing of divorce, and ordered her, while still alive, to be removed from his house to another. So far, he observed the custom strictly through superstition. But the law, which limited the cost of funerals, though he had proposed it himself, he violated by sparing no expense. He also violated his own laws for diminishing the cost of entertainments, endeavoring to forget his grief in extravagant drinking and feasting, and in the company of buffoons. A few months after his wife's death, there was a show of gladiators. As there was yet no distinction of places, but men and women sat promiscuously in the theater, it chanced that a woman seated herself near Sulla who was very handsome and of good family. She was a daughter of Messala, and sister of the orator Hortensius. Her name was Valeria, and she had lately separated from her husband. This woman, going behind Sulla, placed her hand upon him, and pulling a thread out of his dress, returned to her place. As Sulla looked on her with some surprise, she said, "No mischief, Imperator. I also wish to have a bit of your good fortune." Sulla was not displeased at her words, and it was soon plain that he had conceived a passion for the woman, for he privately sent to ask her name, and made himself acquainted with her family and her mode of life. After this, there were interchanges of glances, and frequent side looks, and giving and returning of smiles, and finally, treaties and arrangements about marriage, all which on her part perhaps deserved no censure. But as to Sulla, However chaste and reputable the woman might be that he married, it was no reputable or decent matter that induced him to it, for he was caught, like a young man, by mere looks and wanton airs, the nature of which is to excite the most depraved and impure feelings. 36. Though Sulla married Valeria, he still associated with actresses and female lute players and dancers, spending his time with them on beds and drinking from an early hour of the day. These were the names of the persons who at this time enjoyed most of his favor: Rosius the comedian, Sorix the chief mimus, and Metrobius, who played women's parts in men's dress, and to whom, though Metrobius was now growing old, Sulla all along continued strongly attached, and never attempted to conceal it. By this mode of life he aggravated his disease, which was slight in its origin, and for some time he was not aware that all his viscera were full of diseased matter. The flesh, being corrupted by the disease, was changed into vermin, and though many persons were engaged day and night in taking the vermin away, what was got rid of was nothing compared with what came. For all his clothes, and the bath and the water, and his food, were filled with the matter that flowed from him, and with the vermin. Such was the violence of the disorder. Though he went into the water several times a day, and drenched his body and cleansed it from filth, it was of no avail, for the disease went on too quickly, and the quantity of vermin defied all attempts to clear it away. Among those in very remote times who are said to have died of the lousy disease was Acastus, the son of Peleus, and in more recent times Alcman, the lyric poet, Pherecydes, the theologian, Callisthenes of Olynthus, while he was in prison, and Mucius the lawyer. And if one may mention those who have got a name, not for any good that they did, but in other ways, Eunice the runaway slave, who began the servile war in Sicily, is said to have died of this disease, after he was captured and carried to Rome. 37. Sulla foresaw his end, and even in a manner wrote about it, for he finished the 22nd book of his memoirs only 2 days before his death. He there says that the Chaldeans foretold him that it was his fate to die after a happy life at the very height of his prosperity. He says also that his son, who had died a short time before Metella, appeared to him in a dream, in a mean dress, and standing by him, entreated his father to rest from his troubles, and to go with him to join his mother Metella, and live with her in ease and quiet. Yet he did not give up attending to public matters. 10 days before his death, he restored tranquility among the people of Dicertia, who were in a state of civil commotion, and he drew up for them a constitution. And only 1 day before his death, hearing that the chief magistrate Granius was a public defaulter and refused to pay the debt, waiting for Sulla's death, Sulla sent for the man to his chamber, and surrounding him with his slaves ordered him to be strangled. But with his shouting and efforts he burst an imposthume and vomited a quantity of blood. Upon this his strength failed him, and he got through the night with difficulty. He left 2 infant children by Metella. Valeria, after his death, brought forth a daughter, whom they called Postuma, for this is the name that Romans give to children who are born after their father's death. 38. Now many flocked to Lepidus and combined with him to prevent the body of Sulla from receiving the usual interment. But Pompeius, though he had ground of complaint against Sulla, for he was the only friend whom Sulla had passed over in his will, turning some from their purpose by his influence and entreaties, and others by threats, had the body conveyed to Rome, and secured it a safe and honorable interment. It is said that the women contributed so great a quantity of aromatics for Sulla's funeral that without including what was conveyed in 210 liters, there was enough to make a large figure of Sulla, and also to make a lictor out of costly frankincense and cinnamon. The day was cloudy in the morning, and as rain was expected, they did not bring the body out till the 9th hour. However, a strong wind came down on the funeral pile and raised a great flame, and they had just time to collect the ashes as the pile was sinking and the fire going out, when a heavy rain poured down and lasted till night. So Sulla's good fortune seemed to follow him to his funeral, and to stay with him to the last. His monument is in the Campus Martius. The inscription, which they say he wrote and left behind him, says in substance that none of his friends ever did him a kindness, and none of his enemies never did him a wrong, without being fully repaid.